Hello, everyone. This is Giulio Prisco. This episode of the Turing Church podcast is a conversation with Emily Adlam, the author of a book titled Foundations of Quantum Mechanics and many insightful papers. A conventional local definition of determinism is that the future is determined by the present with causal influences limited by the speed of light, which take time to propagate in space. But Emily argues that the universe doesn't compute itself locally in space and time, place by place and instant by instant, but all at once, globally and self-consistently. I find Emily's approach very interesting and a game changer for philosophy of physics. Hi, Emily. Good to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Could you introduce yourself in more detail?
Yes. I am, as you can see, I am a philosopher of physics. I studied physics and philosophy for my undergrad, and then did a PhD in relativistic quantum information. So that was a pure physics PhD, but now I work more on the philosophy side, doing the philosophy of physics. I'm here at the Rotman Institute at the University of Western Ontario.
So do you call yourself a physicist or a philosopher of physics?
Yes, interesting. Well, there's a fine line between them in many cases. I did my PhD in physics, but I think these days I'm a bit more of a philosopher of physics because rather than focusing in great detail on one topic, as many physicists do, I'm interested in sort of getting the bigger picture and seeing connections between things, and that I think is more in the realm of philosophy.
Great. So could you summarize your Sudoku metaphor for global determinism?
Yes. So the idea here is that we often think about the laws of nature as if they're a bit like a computer. They start at the beginning of time and they evolve towards the other side. They sort of produce the world in some ordered process. But the laws could take some other kind of form. They could be more like the rules of a game of Sudoku. So the rules of a game of Sudoku don't ask you to start at the left and move towards the right of the grid. They just prescribe the whole solution in one go. And there's no sort of privileged order there. You might fill in the grid in some order, but that order is not prescribed by the rules. The rules just tell you that the solution as a whole is correct or incorrect. So the thought is that the laws of nature could be like that. They could just apply to the whole universe all at once, and they could produce a solution as a whole object rather than starting at one side and moving towards somewhere else.
Yeah, I find this a very intuitive metaphor. As a matter of fact, as soon as I read your first paper, I decided to learn Sudoku. I didn't play before, I don't like too much playing games, but I decided to learn to, get an intuitive feeling for these ideas. Now I can solve Sudoku problems that are considered the hardest, those that Sudoku.com calls evil, in about half an hour. Is that good, or should I do that in maybe 5 minutes or even less?
I don't know. I don't actually play Sudoku all that much myself. That sounds good to me, though.
Well, I get the feeling that since there is a unique solution and you can arrive at that solution entirely by logic without guessing, one much smarter than me, and I guess there are computer programs able to do that right now, could figure out the solution at a glance.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know if any people can do that, but certainly a computer probably could.
At least for 9x9 Sudoku. Now, when it comes to huge Sudoku grids with a lot of numbers, that would grow exponentially, I guess.
Yes.
As difficulty. Right. So at some point, not even the best supercomputer could make it.
Yes, it would. Yes, the computational power would certainly be quite demanding for a large grid.
Right. However, I think is a very illuminating metaphor. In your book and other papers, You summarize your ideas, saying that the course of history is determined all at once by external atemporal laws of nature. Now, this suggests to me a concept that is very old and frequently appears in Christian theology, that the universe is deterministic from something like an out-of-time perspective, but it appears deterministic, non-deterministic, seen from our point of view within time. In the Middle Ages, philosophers have discussed that a lot. Now, my intuition tells me that this could be somehow related to Gödel's theorems, in the sense that a consistent mathematical system appears incomplete from within the system. Now, would you agree on that? And perhaps you have done some more thoughts.
Yes, yeah, I have been thinking about this. Definitely, I think there's a relation here. The key point is that the properties of a system that you see from inside it don't always match the properties that you see from the outside. And more generally, there's a sort of problem of underdetermination, because in most cases, what you see from inside the system will not suffice to fully determine what the system looks like from the outside. And sort of no amount of gathering information that we can do from inside the system can establish the fully consistent system as it would appear from outside. So I think this does sort of draw attention to the need to understand the relation between what you can establish from within some system and what the system will look outside, and to be aware of that as we do physics, that what we see is not the complete picture, and that we will never have that complete system, and we can only sort of make inferences to it based on what we can understand.
Now, do you think the last statement that you made, that we can never, underlining never, have complete information about the system that we are part of from within the system, you think is that any way to prove this statement in logic or physics or whatever?
There's various theorems in physics, in general relativity, for example, showing that based on the amount of information that we can get at our location in space-time, given relativistic constraints on where information can go, can never establish things like the global structure of space-time. So when we do the general relativity, we tend to make assumptions about the way the parts of space-time we see are related to the parts we don't see. We assume there's some kind of homogeneity, and there's that the view on the universe that we have is not special, and it would look similar from other places. But those are only assumptions which can't ever be proved, because we can't get outside our own light cone and see what's going on in parts of the global structure of the universe that we don't have access to.
So that these would be strong limitations in principle, not just things that can be overcome with better technology.
Yes, exactly. So assuming that relativity is right in what it tells us about, that information can't travel outside its future light cone, that means that it's in principle impossible for us to get information about parts of the universe outside of the light cone that we have access to.
But doesn't your own conception of determinism in a global sense kind of undermine some of the limits imposed by special relativity?
To some extent, certainly, we know that relativity is not the final answer, and it's possible that when we move to a different theory, we will discover that some of the limitations we thought existed in relativity no longer exist in whatever the successor theory is. But the limits that relativity puts on the transfer of information in particular are quite strong, and there are good reasons for them beyond the structure of relativity itself. So I personally would expect that many of those limitations to continue in a future theory.
Right. Let's move to quantum physics now with these apparently random quantum outcomes, like post-decoherence choices between brackets. Are these determined by global factors distributed all over space and time, including faraway places and future times?
Yes, that they could be is the answer. Or that's kind of the one suggestion that I've made with this global determinism hypothesis. And is, of course, only a hypothesis, it's not established physics. So in established physics, we assume that they're genuinely random and are not determined anything. But the thought in this global determinism hypothesis is that randomness appears because we're trying to write down a sort of evolution theory going from one side to the other, rather than writing this holistic deterministic theory. And we do know, for example, that you can have an altered formalism for quantum mechanics where you add a future boundary condition as well as an initial condition. And in that formalism, in many cases, quantum measurement outcomes are deterministic. The initial condition and the future condition are together enough to determine them. So we do know that allowing a dependence on not just the past, but also the future does at least move us in the direction of having outcomes becoming more deterministic. And the thought is that if we develop that idea further and we could sort of understand that global picture a bit better, perhaps they would all be deterministic.
And going back to my previous point, this, in a sense, seems to contradict what you just said about the limits imposed by special relativity. But I guess your answer was that, even if the information that we would need is out there in some way, is not information that we can acquire. And this is a limitation in principle, because information cannot move from one place to another in a causal way faster than the speed of light.
Yes, so if quantum measurement outcomes do depend in certain ways on things in the future or things that are space-like separated from them, those dependencies would have to be limited or hidden in certain ways, because otherwise we would get strange phenomena like closed causal loops and causal paradoxes and that kind of thing. So it must be the case that we can't just look at the quantum measurement outcome and immediately know something else about the future or about this something space-like separated. That there has to be some that dependence has to be masked in a similar way to we see in non-local quantum correlations. We know there's a dependence between those two measurements, but we can't signal like that. And so my thought is that the dependence here would be of a similar kind. It would be not usable for signaling.
Like what happens behind the scenes in a theater that spectators cannot see from where they're seated.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Now, leaving quantum physics aside and pretending that we live in an entirely classical world for a moment, there are apparently random outcomes also in non-quantum but chaotic dynamical systems. Would what you just say also apply in this case, or there are fundamental differences between the two realms?
Yes, I mean, it depends how you understand classical chaotic systems. I think the mainstream, at least understanding of them, is that all of those outcomes are really deterministic, even in sort of normal classical theory at the most fundamental level, and it's simply our inability to measure the initial conditions precisely enough, which makes them look chaotic. So if that is correct, if that's the right way of thinking about them, then they are deterministic, but not in a global way, just in the ordinary classical way.
There is these interesting arguments put forward by Swiss physicist Nicolas Gisin to argue that classical physics itself is very deeply, strongly, and irreducibly non-deterministic. And the answer is that real numbers don't exist. The thing is that, a real number is something that you're supposed to specify with infinite precision, so that it's not a physical concept. As a matter of fact, many others, like Max Born, said exactly the same things. Now, I do find these arguments very persuasive. And, I'm kind of persuaded that similar arguments show that the difference between classical physics and quantum physics, as far as determinism is concerned, are not that strong in principle as they're often thought. And what are your thoughts about that?
Yes, I also very much like Shizan's approach. I think maybe the best way of thinking about it is that it's showing us that, in a sense, classical physics was really never self-consistent. The description of the world that it presented to us was, in some sense, deeply wrong or mistaken, and particularly when you try to push it down to very small scales. So in a sense, it's given that, it's not very surprising that we found that, in fact, when we did try to go down to very small scales, it turns out classical physics breaks down and is wrong in its description of the world, because that description, the infinitely precise deterministic picture of the world that it gave to us was really never a viable one.
Right. And, trying now to put these things together, or at least in the same framework with quantum physics, there are these suggestions that, the fact that we live in a quantum world is something that is only apparent, and underlying our quantum worlds, there is something more classical, in the sense that it could be described by standard differential equations, but the presence of strongly fractal chaos introduces some lack of determinism, which causes the world to appear quantum, something like that. Do you relate to these ideas?
I'm definitely interested in the possibility of there being something else underlying quantum mechanics, some further completion of the theory or addition to it. I personally don't think that whatever is underneath quantum mechanics is likely to be classical, because there are just too many features of quantum mechanics that are very clearly non-classical. So my view is that whatever underlies quantum mechanics will actually probably be less classical than quantum mechanics, rather than more classical than quantum mechanics.
Right.
Weirder rather than less weird.
For example, are you familiar with the ideas of Tim Palmer?
Yes.
And what do you think of that?
Yes, I really like Tim's approach. And in fact, Tim describes his approach as being super deterministic, whereas I think this sort of fractal idea, perhaps with some small changes, or perhaps even just as is, could also be thought of as just being globally deterministic rather than super deterministic. He wants to describe it as a local superdeterministic approach, but I think it could equally well be thought of as a non-local, globally deterministic approach, where the sort of the global structure of the fractal is what is responsible for, in a sort of global, non-local way, for the configuration of events we actually experience. So yeah, I'm interested in the sort of connections between that view and my own view.
Yeah, that was kind of my reaction as well after reading his papers and his recently published book. The thing is that he says, and he insists many times, that his theory is local, in some sense of the word local. But the thing is that going back to a more intuitive sense of the world, a theory where things that happen here and now depends on things that happen in an extremely remote future with interaction between the world now and some future worlds. I mean, that's a kind of very strongly non-local. By definition, I understand that he's using locality in a very technical way, and perhaps in his sense, he's right. But, as somebody who is walking in the street, it does look very much non-local and non-deterministic to me.
Yes, and I think perhaps emphasizing locality too much for me is perhaps taking away from some of the other strengths of the view, because restoring locality to quantum physics is something that a lot of people want to do, but it's not the be all and end all. And I think Tim Palmer's views are a really interesting way of thinking about what could be responsible for quantum mechanics, regardless of whether one considers them to be local or not. So I perhaps like to focus less on locality and think more about the broader consequences of this kind of view.
Mm-hmm. Now let's move to general relativity, but well, these things are so much interrelated that we could not perhaps even divide them by category. So in this nice paper called Spooky Action at the Temporal Distance, and also in your book, you note that general relativity is usually interpreted as a temporally local theory, but you also suggest that it should be interpreted as an temporally non-local theory, because a solution to the Einstein field equations is, as a matter of fact, a full entire history of a space-time. Now, do you think the breakdown of local determinism in space-times with things like naked singularities and closed time-like curves suggest that your interpretation is correct?
Yes. So this is interesting, because the general relativity is usually written in a sort of form which looks very temporally non-local. It's where the solution is just an entire history rather than sort of stated at a time. But it can also be written in a time evolution form, where you take an initial state, you put certain constraints on it, and then evolve it forward. But the space of solutions that you can produce by using the time evolution equations is smaller than the space of solutions to the original equations. The time evolution form will only produce spacetimes which are globally hyperbolic, whereas there are various spacetimes which are solutions to the original equations which are not globally hyperbolic, and those include the ones with naked singularities and the ones with closed time-like curves. So on the one hand, someone who's just very insistent that the world must be temporally local might perhaps argue that, I believe the real equations of general relativity are the evolution ones, and therefore our space-time must be globally hyperbolic, and therefore there won't be any naked singularities or closed time-like curves. But on the other hand, one might worry that seems poorly justified. There's this perfectly mathematically well-defined space of solutions to the Einstein equations. We don't really have any reason other than prejudice in favor of temporal locality to rule out the non-globally hyperbolic ones. So maybe we should take those seriously, and we should accept them as possible solutions to the Einstein equations. In which case, yes, those phenomena do look like, if they exist, would certainly be evidence that this all at once temporally non-local approach is the right one.
Fascinating. As far as I understand, the concept a globally hyperbolic space-time is one that can be kind of divided in space-like slices in such a way as to be able to assign initial conditions onto one time slice and propagate these conditions in time. But you say this is an assumption, it seems to me, due to aesthetic and philosophical preferences. It's not in Einstein's field equations themselves.
Indeed, yes. Certainly Einstein's field equations perfectly happily admit solutions which don't have that globally hyperbolic property. So it's assuming that the world must be globally hyperbolic involves making a further assumption that some class of solutions, even though they're mathematically well-defined, must somehow be physically impossible.
Now going back to the hypothetical possibility to derive the quantum mechanics from something else without saying what that something else could be. I'm just thinking aloud now of the fact that many times in recent history, the last few decades, the concept that perhaps elementary particles are space-time singularities has been proposed and even studied. Some derivation of the fact that I believe some kind of singularity would propagate in a space-time according to the usual geodesics of space-time. Now, it seems to me that if something in this approach is correct, and importing in the theory the results about the non-determinism which would be induced in non-globally hyperbolic spacetimes, it seems to me, well, very qualitatively, and I'm just thinking aloud, it seems to me that some progress could be made toward some kind of derivation of quantum mechanics from perhaps a modified version of general relativity.
Yes, yes, it depends a lot on the details, but
of course,
interesting possibility, because obviously one of the reasons we'd like to have a different interpretation of quantum mechanics is because quantum mechanics in its current form is quite hard to unify with general relativity. So if we could understand quantum particles as being derived in some sense from general relativity, that would hopefully be a step on the road to bringing those theories together in a way that so far has been quite difficult to achieve.
Yeah, now let's briefly move to things that are considered more philosophical, which is free will. In one of your papers, you say that, and I'm quoting here, we could have free will in the context of some sorts of holistic determinism. Our actions are determined by other events, but also those events are partly determined by our actions. So in other words, a holistic universe without me would be a different universe, and therefore I am a partly free agent in this holistic universe. Now, this is a subtle concept of free will, perhaps different from the intuitive one, but strong in its own sense, and I can almost agree. Do you, or perhaps I do agree, but do you find this concept of free will emotionally acceptable? And how would you persuade one who doesn't?
Yes, so I think there are various the concerns that people have about free will in physics differ, but one of the major things people worry about is the idea that my actions can't be free in a sort of standardly deterministic theory, because everything I ever do is determined, by the initial state of the universe long before I ever existed, and so it's this determination by things in the past, which means that my actions there's no sense in which they are free. So I think once you move to a more global picture, it's no longer true to say that, oh, my actions are just determined by the past, because in that global picture, there isn't a privileged moment. It isn't the case that the initial state determines the rest and not vice versa. Right. All moments are kind of equal in that picture. So yes, there is a determination relation there, but it's just as true to say my actions determine the past as it is to say the past determines my actions. So I think there is certainly some kind of freedom there. It's a sort of participatory freedom rather than the strong kind of freedom that dualists might have wanted, but it looks more like freedom to me than what we have in a sort of standard deterministic picture. I think sort of in the standard deterministic picture, we really definitely don't have free will. So even if this kind of freedom is a bit subtle and a bit weaker than what the dualists might perhaps want, I think it's better than the alternative, which is no free will at all.
Right, and in fact, I think the core idea here is that instead of saying that the initial conditions at the beginning of the universe determine my actions here and now, I could as well say it the other way around, that my actions here and now are determining the initial conditions at the beginning of the universe. And because of time symmetry, there is no way to there is no rational way to say that one statement is more correct than the other.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it's not the case that the past just decided all my actions. My choice is just as valid as the other description.
Yeah, this I think about this a lot, and I will continue to think about it. But yet, it's almost sounds like a good and very strong concept of free will.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
In another paper, which also won a prize, I think, you say that the laws of nature, I start quoting, apply simple macroscopic constraints to the universe as a whole and work out what needs to happen on a more fine-grained level in order to satisfy these constraints. And here, I believe that you have things like the law of thermodynamics in mind, something like that. But thinking about all the ideas that are being developed now about the fact that the universe is somehow tuned to prefer the emergence of complexity, life, and consciousness, and perhaps even some kind of quality in Robert Pirsig's sense. In your scheme, do you think that these very high level constraints, much higher level than simple thermodynamics, could play a role in how the universe makes decisions?
It's possible. Sort of more or less anything you can imagine could be written in the form of a constraint, right? So mathematically it can be done. So the question is then, if we're going to move to this kind of constraint-based picture, we're going to need, good criteria that we can use to judge whether, is this a constraint? Should we think of this as being part of the objective structure of reality or not? Presumably those criteria will do something like look at the sort of relative simplicity and power of different possible sets of constraints. How few constraints do I need to sort of explain everything? What is the balance between making the constraints simpler versus losing predictive power? So exactly how to establish which set of constraints is the right set of constraints it's certainly non-trivial. But I think the sort of the standard methods that scientists have used, since forever to judge between different hypotheses are applicable here too. It will be about saying, what's the sort of simplest set of constraints? What's the most powerful set of constraints? How can we combine them?
Just trying to think of what kind of very weird mathematics you might have to use to include high-level concepts within the constraints of the universe. Nothing that I can imagine, of course.
Yes, I mean, I suspect that to write laws in a constraint-based form and derive consequences from them in a proper formal mathematical way would potentially require the development of new types of maths, or perhaps just the use of some type of maths that exists in pure mathematics but hasn't so far been used in physics.
Do you have any hunch of what that mathematics could be?
It's unclear. A lot of the methods of physics do use some all-at-once type formulation. So we do have, for example, Lagrangian formulations in which we optimize some quantity over the entire history rather than starting at one side and going towards the other end. So I would suspect it would be, the Lagrangian type methods are a good start, and I would suspect it would generalize. I think beyond that would be interesting.
Right. Now, in the same paper that I was quoting from, you continue and say, presumably, at least some features will be left underdetermined by the global constraints. Now, I read this to an opening to residual non-determinism or to multiple worlds. Now, going back to the Sudoku metaphor, if a Sudoku problem has been properly set up, it has a unique solution. But a problem that has not been so probably set up can be underdetermined with multiple solutions or overdetermined with no solution. So thinking on how the universe plays cosmic Sudoku, I can imagine that in some cases, there could be no unique solution boundary between over and under determination. So the universe should make this choice. And of course, it would choose to split and become many worlds instead of disappearing and becoming no world, which kind of looks like, conceptually at least, the idea of a multiverse. And can you comment on that?
Yes, yeah, I think that the possibility of there being no unique solution boundary is a really interesting one. So I think it's very likely that there is no unique solution. The question of what happens if there's no unique solution is a bit subtle. So yet one possibility is that all of the solutions are just realized as distinct universes. The other possibility is that the universe just chooses one solution. I guess I have some concerns about the multiple universe possibility, because I've worked on multiverses in other contexts, and they do tend to lead to some quite serious sort of epistemic problems, particularly if you can't have if you can't define a sensible probability distribution over them, because then there's the concern that you can't sensibly infer back from your observations to any features of the theory which are responsible for your observations, because just all the observations get realized. So I'm personally inclined to say that in the case where there's multiple solutions, just one of them is realized at random or arbitrarily. But also there's really no way we can know, right? Because from our point of view, we'll always look as if just one was realized arbitrarily or at random. And I guess there's no direct way to know whether the others were realized or not from within a single universe.
In this context, in fact, I would find it surprising if one choice were made at random, because when we are at this point, the universe has already used all these constraint-based methods that we have been discussing. So at that point, to make a choice among multiple evolution possibilities, the universe has already done all that it could do. And a random choice would beg the question of where it comes from.
Well, it's very similar, I think, to in the standard deterministic picture. There's many different possible courses of history which are compatible with the laws, and the universe just chooses one by selecting an initial condition, and that initial condition is what determines which course of history actually occurs. And so in the globally deterministic picture, this choosing one out of all the universes which are consistent with the laws is basically the same thing. It's equivalent to choosing an initial condition. So if you were happy with the idea of there being an initial condition and that determining the course of history in the standard deterministic picture, I think it's also reasonable to think that in the globally deterministic picture, just some equivalent of a generalized version of initial condition is chosen, and that's what determines the course of history. But then again, perhaps one might say that even in the standard deterministic picture, that was always a problem, and we should assume that all the possible initial conditions are realized in different universes.
Or could that be something like new criteria, new evolution criteria that sort of appear just in time on demand because there is one new configuration to solve? Like until now, I've been using these rules, but now I cannot solve this within those rules, and I need to add another one. And that also sounds like Godel in a way, doesn't it?
Yes, possibly. Yeah, possibly there would ultimately be another constraint added to select just one. Yes.
It's really fascinating to reflect about these things. Now, one of the first things that came to my mind reading your papers was the film Arrival, and especially the novella by Ted Chiang, upon which it is based. There are interesting parallels with your ideas, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, Ted Chiang is a great writer and very, very informed by science and by interesting ideas in physics. Definitely, both without giving any spoilers, Arrival and the novella Story of Your Life play with these ideas about time and the idea of a sort of block universe and time being all present at once rather than flowing from one side to another. So it's a good I think example of what kinds of interesting things could follow from that way of thinking. Yeah, I met Ted Chiang over the summer and discussed some of these things.
Wow. He's one of my favorite writers.
He definitely agreed that there's some similar ideas here.
Since you met him, you have any idea when we can expect his first full-length novel?
No, he didn't. I didn't discuss that, but I would be
because
excited.
he only wrote shorter stories. I mean, if he had a full novel, I read very fast, so a short story is too short for me. I like to read big books.
I'd love to read a novel from him. Yes.
If you think of what happens in the story and also in the movie, see that he goes much beyond the scientific things that we are discussing. Because he says something like, if you train yourself to think in this way, like, for example, I have been training myself to play Sudoku, to understand your ideas. If you train yourself to think of the world in terms of global determinism, at some point things switch in your mind, and I think I can't give spoilers because I believe everyone has seen the film. You become able to remember the future. Now, I do not think that can happen that simply. I mean, I can play Sudoku for years, but I'm not going to be able to remember the future. But do you think that some kind of future evolution of human beings, either natural or induced by technology, could enable us to see much more of reality that we are seeing right now, and perhaps remember something that will happen?
Yes.
So I would need better ways of saying it, but you understand what I mean.
I think our ability to remember only the past is very closely linked to our ability to take action into the future. That's because, if you could remember both, if you can remember the future, then and you can also take action to change the future, then you end up with paradoxes where you remember something that's happened in the future and then you take action to prevent it, and then that's a logical paradox. So I think in order for us to be the kinds of creatures which have the ability to take action and to cause things to happen in the future, we have to have limited ability to remember the future, because otherwise that would just be logically impossible. So if we were to evolve towards being able to remember more of the future, I think that would have to come with at the same time an evolution towards being less able to take action and to affect things in the future. So that would be an interesting change in the types of agents that we are. We would have to be more sort of passive witnessing and less active causing things to happen.
Yeah, in fact, I was thinking that there is a science fiction novel about that, written by a fellow Australian. I'm sorry, does that way of putting things make a New Zealander upset? Can I say a fellow Australian? I mean, somebody who comes from that part of the world.
The end, we say.
And the writer is Greg Egan, and the novel is called Terranisia.
Okay.
There's some life forms able to sense quantum possibilities and act upon them. It's a very nice novel. Did I lose your voice?
No, I don't think so.
Great. In general, leaving aside what we could become, does it make sense to think that some kind of life form in the universe, perhaps extremely different from ourselves, could have this global perspective on reality that doesn't break the symmetry between past and future?
Yes, it sort of seems at least technically possible, but again, I think it's a creature or a being which had the ability to sort of see both the past and future in that way would necessarily have to have very limited ability to intervene and to produce changes in things, because otherwise logical paradoxes. So that being would have to be very different to us, not only in its ability to know things and to see the past and the future, but also in the way in which it interacts with the world and the way in which it is able to take action and influence things.
In fact, this brings me to the last point that I had in mind, which is that, okay, now let's assume that some very weird aliens or some concept of God has this global perspective. Now, it seems to me intuitively that this being would lead a very boring life. Because,
yes,
in his world, nothing new ever happens by definition. So I tend to think that, once you follow your approach, that, there is this self-consistent thing consisting of space and time, couldn't there be another timeline dimension beyond that, and then another one, and then another one, and then another one, so that at any point in the hierarchy, the universe has some elbow room, some space for change? Again, I say that in a very imprecise way, but I guess you understand. What do you think?
Yes, I mean, I think that's certainly possible. It's by definition, we don't have access to whatever there is outside our universe. So we don't have, not going to have any direct way to find out about the hierarchy of other space-times in which ours is embedded in that sense. I guess I would emphasize that in order to make sense of this kind of globally deterministic picture, one doesn't need any time outside the universe. It's enough to just have just have our universe with its time and space built in, and with nothing, with no sort of sense of time outside of it. But it's possible that there could be such a thing. It's just not necessary.
So you have given me a lot to think about for days and for weeks. And thank you very much for finding the time to join me.
Yeah, thank you. This has been really good.
And I'm going to stop recording now. And I hope to talk to you again soon.